I'm starting a sermon series this morning on how to live a powerful life. Let me say simply that I hope that every time one of us gets up here to proclaim the good news, the gospel, that we are in fact proclaiming ways in which we embrace the powerful life given to us through the grace of Jesus Christ. But the next 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about 3 specific ways in which we can live more powerful lives as individuals. Today, it's a pretty simple theme. It's just simply that when we become a part of something greater than we are, that's how we, in fact, live more powerfully. And so I'm going to invite you to turn to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, the 12th verse. I was going to read the whole 12th verse because it kind of stands alone. It's one kind of concrete message here, but the whole 12th verse is a bit long. So I'm going to read verses 4 through 21 or 22, I think it is. Let me point out that when Paul writes to the Romans, some of you came to my Romans Bible study the other night. When Paul writes to the Romans, he's really writing a theological treatise. But when he writes to Corinth, he's writing to a church that he knows well, and he's talking about very pragmatic church matters. The church at Corinth had splintered. There were factions. There were fights. Ever known a church like that? Maybe? You know, they weren't getting along very well. Some of them were arrogant, said, we're more important than you. It was kind of coming apart. And so this 12th chapter is really an important chapter, and partly because it is prelude to what? The next chapter, probably the best known and best loved chapter in the New Testament, is the 13th chapter, Paul's words about love. So this really sets the context for his really well-known 13th chapter. So we're going to start here, the 12th chapter, verse 4. He wants to make the point there are all sorts of different kinds of gifts and talents in the church. They're all important. Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of services, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in every one. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom. To another the utterance of knowledge according to that same Spirit. To another faith by the same Spirit. To another gifts of healing by that one Spirit. To another the working of miracles or prophecy. To another the discernment of spirits. To another various kinds of tongues. To another the interpretation of tongues. Remember where he says in the 13th chapter, read the 13th chapter, he talks about tongues, not the most important thing. All these are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually just as the Spirit chooses. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, he goes into this analogy now, this allegory about the body, though many are one body, so it is with Christ. For in the one Spirit we are all baptized into one body. Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and we are all made to drink of one Spirit. Indeed, the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot would say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear would say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? He's making the point that each part is extraordinarily important. If the whole body were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many members, yet one body. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The date was April 20th, 1997. It was a rather remarkable moment. That was the date of the first worship service on this property here at 3101 Coit Road. Some of you were there and you remember that moment. This year is our 40th anniversary, and we've been talking about generations of generosity. When I look back at that particular moment, it really just amazes me that we were able to do it, and it was only by God's grace and through God's power. Because here's what happened. In the early 90s, we discovered this piece of property. It was with the RTC. You may remember that. We got a good deal on the property, but it was still very expensive, almost $1 million. We put a contract on this property, but because we were just a little tiny band of United Methodists worshiping over at Glencliff, we didn't have the money to pay for it. And so we had a 3-year capital campaign. We spent 3 years raising the money to pay for nothing but the dirt. Just the dirt. Wheat was growing on this property during all those years. And then after 3 years, after we had finally paid for the dirt, we had another 3-year capital campaign, and we raised the money to build the first building. It took over 2 years to plan, design, and build the first building. So the journey had taken us almost 6 years. But then suddenly there we found ourselves over in what is now Trinity Hall, April the 20th, 1997. And I did something in that first worship service that someone suggested to me. I think it was Lynn Randall that gave me this idea. And it has been so powerful through all these years. At that time, we had 3 windows. We had the baptismal window, the communion window, I've got it back, the baptismal window, the communion window, and the Easter window were all in Trinity Hall at that time. And I invited everyone there, member or visitor, didn't make any difference, to pick out a piece of glass, to look at the 3 windows, and to find the one little piece of glass that was their favorite. And I see some of you finding your piece of glass even as I speak here. And I said, I'm going to give you that piece of glass. It will be yours forever. Cherish it in your heart. And everybody picked out a piece of glass. It's been fascinating to me. People have been members of this church and have moved away, been away for years. And I've seen them come through this front door to come back home and visit. And they'll tell me, the first thing I did was look and pick out my piece of glass. It's been so powerful. So on our first Sunday in this particular sanctuary 2 or 3 years ago, in May, I think it was, I extended that invitation again. Now we had 6 of these wonderful Linda Smith designed windows. And I said, if you weren't here on April the 20th, 1997, I want you to have the opportunity, whether you are a member or a visitor, to pick out a piece of glass. Find the piece of glass that you love the most. I give it to you. It'll be yours forevermore. This morning, because of the theme of the sermon, I'm going to issue that invitation again. If you weren't here for the first service in this building or in Trinity Hall, you've never had an opportunity to pick out a piece of glass, I want you to find your piece of glass. You can be out of any of the 6 windows. It'll be yours forever. I hope that you will always cherish it. And that whenever you come into this room, you'll find your piece of glass and think about it. And so while you're doing that, I'll invite everybody to find your piece of glass and just to kind of focus or meditate or think about your particular individual piece of glass while I say a word about the scripture from Corinthians. Paul knew the church of Corinth quite well. He knew that it was a church that was coming apart. They were fighting with one another. Some of the people were saying, look, the gift which I have may be speaking in tongues. The gift which I have is more important than the gift that you have. People were being arrogant. People were leaving. It was a divisive church. If you'll read the 12th chapter and then the 13th chapter on love, where Paul says, but above all, love is the most important gift because it is love that unites us, then you kind of get an understanding, a new and richer understanding of that 13th chapter on love. At any rate, Paul's writing to a divided church where they're just scattering apart. They haven't come together. And he really makes 2 points. Extremely salient points. The first is this. He says, I want you to know that every piece counts. I want you to know that every member counts. And so he talks about these various gifts. He says you may have the gift of speaking in tongues, or you may have the gift of interpreting tongues. You may have the gift of prophecy or the gift of wisdom. Guess what? They're all important. One is not more important than the other. They've all been blessed by God, and you should respect and embrace the gifts of every other person and come together with them. And then Paul, being the typical preacher, in order to make his point, comes up with this wonderful image of the body. And he speaks anatomically. He says, look at the foot. It's just as important as the hand just as important as the eye, the ear. Now, I admit to you that every time I read this particular 12th chapter of Corinthians, I think about one of my favorite Charles Schulz's cartoons. Snoopy is out jogging, and he's been jogging for a while, and the different parts of his body begin to complain. The foot says, I'm getting really, really tired. And then the knee says, yeah, I'm really hurting. And then the hip says, I'm getting really tired and hurting both. And in the last frame, the heart pops up and says, just remember this, boys. If I go, you all go. Something to remember. But nevertheless, he talks anatomically about the body, and he says all the parts of the body are important. If they didn't have different functions, the body would not function properly. So every piece counts. Now I want to divert just for a moment and talk just a little bit. This is stewardship time in the life of our church. I want to talk with you about some things that some of the young members of the staff have said to me. They said, Don, you know, you do a pretty good job of talking about stewardship, but let me tell you, you have not made the case that the young person who's just starting out, or that the person on a limited salary, that their gift makes a difference. I said, what do you mean? They said, you just haven't made that case in a compelling way. This is what they told me. They said, people can walk into this building and see this wonderful building, how large it is and well built it is, and then they can start thumbing through the list of programs, these powerful programs that we have. They know that we have a budget that's over $4 million. And it's so easy. They're speaking specifically for young people in their 20s, early 30s. It's so easy for a young person to say, they don't really need my money. You need to make that case. So let me do that today. Let me do that. Every piece counts. Every part counts. Every gift counts. I'm not sure, but I think we have 2,500 givers a year in the life of this church. Some people give $1 a week, $52 a year. Some people give $1,000 a week, $52,000 a year. But every single gift counts. In recent years, I've tried to stop speaking about givers and speak about donors instead, because I think that paints the picture better. We are donors to something that is really important, that makes a difference in the kingdom of God. Let me use a very personal illustration. A lot of you know that I serve on the board of trustees of my university, Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas. A number of you have children or grandchildren that have gone to Southwestern and received really good educations. I'm very, very proud of my school. And I've been on the board for, I think, 14 years now. For 8 years, I chaired the fiscal affairs. I was the only preacher they ever got to chair the fiscal affairs committee at Southwestern. Most of my best friends on that board are $1 million donors to the university. A couple of them one of them and another donor are, depending on where the stock market is at any particular time, are certifiable billionaires. It would be easy for me to think that my gift doesn't count. I'll just be personal. I give $2,000 a year to my university. It would be easy for me to think that my gift of $2,000 doesn't make any difference amongst these friends of mine who give $1 million a year. But because I chaired the Fiscal Affairs Committee, I know differently. Those $1 million gifts wouldn't make any difference if it weren't for all the $2,000 gifts and the $1,000 gifts and the $100 gifts that are given by alumni and others to make the picture complete. We are all donors at Southwestern. And you are all donors at this church, and your gift makes a difference. And so here's the second point, and this is what's most relevant about this concept of living a powerful life. Paul says this. He says, every piece counts, and that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Ever heard that before? There's a wonderful German word called Gestalt. It means whole. And Paul is saying that when you all in the church in Corinth are divided and you're going your own ways and you haven't come together, the church loses power. And you lose personal power because you're not a part of something that transcends who you are. But he says when you come together with your gifts, your wisdom, your prophecy, your generosity, when you come together to be a part of something that is greater than yourself, something that transcends you, then that becomes something powerful for the kingdom of God. You know this in your own life. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And that if you want to live a powerful life, you become part of something that transcends who you are. You come together. We'll have a great way of illustrating this morning. We have a new young graphic artist. She's in her 20s on our staff named Melissa Webb. She grew up in this church, literally. Her father was the chairman of the construction committee for phase 1. He was the chairman of the building committee for this building. And Melissa took this stained glass window, the Easter window. She took a digital image of this, and I have the faintest idea how she did this. But she took a digital image of this window, and she literally took it apart piece by piece. She took every piece of glass out of this window digitally. I'm curious, how many of you, your piece of glass is in this window? Quite a few. Yeah, a lot, quite a few. And then Ben Shamness up here, our director of media, and I surely don't have any idea how he did this. He took what Melissa had done and he created a movie, an animation. And really, I could have just shown this movie and saved you a lot of time and made the big point. But I had to say a few words. You're paying me for it. Ben, let's show I want you to see the pieces of glass. Now, if I were to show this to you without telling you, you wouldn't have any idea what this is, would you? I'd say, what is this? You wouldn't know. Maybe an image of space. But if your piece of glass is in this window, it's in this video right here. These are all the different pieces of glass out of this window. That's what Melissa did. This is what Ben did. I feel like I'm part of a TED Talk. That's pretty powerful, isn't it? When we all come together, we create something beautiful. When we bring our little pieces and we all come together, we create something powerful. That's what we do in this church. During the Sundays of Stewardship Month, we are always pleased to say we want you to consider the ways in which you will generously support the ministries of this church, because when we come together, we create beautiful and powerful ministries. And here's one example.